Prime Minister Modi speaking at the USIBC event, and a couple of key points that he made. Of course, the most important one being that if American investors are looking for the perfect time to invest in India, this is the perfect time. He listed off, in fact, rattled off a list of sectors which would be a great investment opportunity, right from aviation to insurance to energy, food processing, you name it. But I think one very key sentence in that speech was where Prime Minister Modi said that in the rise of India, you will be then trading with a partner who you can trust. And that is a very important message in the current global context and in the sense of where India wants to position herself in the world order. Let me go across now to our experts who are joining us to break down where the India-US relationship stands currently. I have with me Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the United States. Richard Rossow joins us this evening. He's the Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at the CSIS. Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador and former permanent representative of India to the WTO, is with us, as is Dr. Ajay Dua, former DIPP Secretary. So welcome to all of you and great to have you on the show. Ambassador Shankar, let me begin just with your take on a couple of things. Of course, what Prime Minister Modi has said and the open invitation to investors, which is something that the Indian government has reiterated often. But in the context of what Mr. Pompeo said earlier in the day on this summit, saying very clearly and indicating that China and the Chinese government is a threat. It's a common threat that is perceived to be so by the US and India.
Yeah, clearly this meeting is taking place at a juncture when the strategic convergence between the US and India in the Indo-Pacific is far stronger, especially in the light of the challenge that the US and even more so India are facing from an increasingly assertive, even aggressive China. We have the Chinese intrusions on our border, negotiations still going on, and indications that the Chinese are digging in some places. So this is a very important strategic juncture for the India-US relationship. The economic relationship has been going well in terms of the overall trade in goods and services. But I think investment from the US has been below its potential. And we hope that there will be more investment as we go on, particularly direct investment, because yes, institutional investment has been quite high, but we're really looking for foreign direct investment at this stage. And of course, you have in this backdrop the rather optimistic pronouncement by Commerce Minister Goyal that there could soon be a mini trade deal between US and India by way of preferential trade, and that both countries would look in future to a bigger trade deal by way of a by way of a free trade agreement, though the timing of this will be well into the future.
Yeah. Rick Rossow, great to speak to you again after quite some time. But one thing that strikes me is when you look at the India-US relationship, the quotes are superb. Right, you have Donald Trump, U.S. president, talking very often about how, in how high regard he holds Prime Minister Modi. India always speaks very warmly and welcoming about U.S. investments, etc. But if you look at what has actually happened, Yes, bilateral trade has increased, but perhaps not at the pace it could. In the interim, you've had sanctions on each other, which have been put to, and a lot of bitterness through 2019. You've had the rescinding of the GSP, which would have given India some special advantage by the United States in last year, this time, a little before this time. That has not been taken back. Then you have this action on H-1B visas, you have the action on foreign students, which now has been rolled back. So if you look at action and words, do you think that there is a mismatch there?
There's a bit of a mismatch. As Ambassador Shankar correctly pointed out, U.S.-India trade has actually grown at a pretty healthy clip. I'm talking, of course, about the pre-COVID period. But that's in spite of a lot of steps that both governments have been doing, as you pointed out. Dating before President Trump was elected, I think Prime Minister Modi came to office 6 years ago, saw that India had a massive trade deficit with the world, and most specifically with China, and has been imposing a lot of trade restrictions since that time. Every budget has got new customs duties. You see an expansion of import substitution rules, and even some of India's nascent steps to form new trade agreements with Europe, Australia, and many other partners, as well as RCEP. They pulled away from doing that. So I think that you've seen, even before President Trump's election, trade protectionism pretty strongly in India because of this massive trade deficit. I think with President Trump, you've got a president who, anytime that he sees a potential for a trade fight around the world, he looks to pick it up with relish because he thinks that appeals to his voting base here in the United States. So tensions between the two, because of real substantive steps to close markets, are very real. The question is, I think, as India's tensions with China have increased, would the Indian government be more willing to put up trade restrictions and trade barriers that are more China-oriented rather than kind of global application? If that's the case, then frankly, I think some of the problems that have triggered the crisis on U.S.-India trade ties can be resolved. But that's a difficult step to take. There's a different set of tools that you use to impose single country barriers. And we'll see whether or not India is going to be willing to do that in the future. So trade is pretty good. Trade ties, though, have been very sour for the reasons you pointed out.
Yeah. The thing is, can India have differential treatment under norms of the WTO, etc.? Jayant Dasgupta, do you want to come in on that? How can India and US now move beyond rhetoric, beyond the politically correct statements, to actually realize the potential there is?
Under the WTO, it is possible to have differential treatment between two members, and to the exclusion of others who will still be getting the MFN treatment. But this can only happen through an FTA. And the second point in this regard is that if it is between a developed country and anybody else, it has to be substantial coverage of trade, which means that basically all sectors of the universe, the product universe and services universe will have to be covered. Of course, it has never been decided by the dispute settlement body of the WTO as to what substantial trade coverage means. But you can't just dabble at a few sectors or a few tariff lines, 50 products, and then have a kind of an agreement. That is just not allowed under the WTO. Now, having said that, it is also a fact that the dispute settlement system of the WTO is currently non-functional because the US has not allowed the appellate body to be populated and to function. So, if we decide to have a limited scope agreement with the US, it would, of course, be against the WTO discipline. And, we will have to see what consequences it will bring about in future.
Yeah. Mr. Dua, let's talk about where this trade deal is stuck. And this trade deal has been stuck for a while. Now, latest reports indicating that, India may give a little on one big bugbear, which is access to American dairy products for our market. We're huge consumers of dairy products, with the conditionality that these products will be properly marked and made sure that they are in line with religious sensibilities here, and there's no sort of animal feed going on, etc. Do you think that there could be the right and conducive atmosphere for these kind of relaxations?
If you recall that when President Trump came to India in February, there were expectations that such a limited accord would be signed during that visit. But for some certain reasons, it couldn't be done. We ended up only signing a couple of defense deals worth $3 billion of imports from the US. Having said that, I think what India has been requesting the US for quite some time, that is greater access to the US markets. And it becomes now even more important considering our relations, new set of relations with China, where trade is bound to take a hit consequent to what's happening on our borders, whether it's imports from India or it's exports from China to us. That's not going to be things as normal. So in turn, we have agreed, as the newspapers reported today and yesterday, that we are willing, though, RCEP discussions were mentioned earlier by Meera. RCEP, one of the reasons why we didn't go through, apart from the fear of China, was dairy imports from New Zealand, because New Zealand can flood with 5% only what China had agreed to import from New Zealand. 5% was enough to kill the Chinese dairying industry, because the New Zealanders do commercial dairying. I think this does show that despite dairying is as much an agricultural business as agriculture per se, something which we wouldn't have opened earlier, but we are now being pragmatic. That if we need access to the US markets, the US is also, in the last 4 years in particular, rather transactional. And unless we give in on something, they won't agree to take this step forward. Legality of a limited trade deal, Jayant mentioned about it, but the US always finds a way about it. If you would recall, when it imposed a 25% duty on steel imports from India and 10% on aluminium, it invoked a security provision that under the US trade protection law, there is a security provision. The security of the US was threatened, and they invoked that, and the duties on aluminium, marginal imports from India, but the USTR or the US Commerce Department did find a way out of how to go about it. We are also hoping that this limited trade accord itself will clearly say that the GSP, which was removed last year and affected about $1.4 billion of our exports, that would be restored entirely on all the items, or at least on the main ones partially. I'm hoping that we do make progress, because unless we cement our trade relationship, investment relationships, I think strategic partnership level which we have reached in February this year, and yesterday the Defense Secretary of the US talked about saying this is going to be the deal, strategic relationship with India is going to be the deal of the century. It won't get cemented. So I'm hoping that we would make considerable progress both in trade and investment, just in order to...
So this is what Minister Piyush Goyal also said. Minister Piyush Goyal has also said that, a trade deal or a limited trade deal could be inked soon. I want to understand this, Rick, and I'm going to come to you, in the context of what is happening with China right now. So two sets of things, and from different perspectives. From the Indian perspective, we're anyway on a stated trajectory of self-reliance. The Prime Minister spoke about it as well. and then add to that the border clash with China and the realization once more that we need to reduce our dependence. On the American side, President Trump very clear about his criticism of China. We heard that in what Mr. Pompeo said as well. To what extent do those two worldviews actually align at this point, and how sustainable is it, considering that the United States is going to undergo possibly a huge political shift in just a few months, elections around the corner?
Well, I think so far we've been able to kind of maintain, at least the administration has, pretty strong silos in how we engage India on strategic matters versus trade and commercial matters. There's been very little blending, either in a positive or luckily a negative sense, meaning that the disputes that we have in the trade area have not limited, the kind of views that we got and things that we've been able to put on the table, both sides, in terms of shoring up security cooperation. Now, where that becomes a more of a problematic issue, I think, is when you go to U.S. Congress, where a lot of times members of Congress and senators, the last constituent that they may have heard from was a U.S. company that may have seen a little bit of a market access loss because, again, some of these customs duty hikes, import substitution, things like that. But luckily too, I think that you don't have commonplace legislation, that will dramatically impact U.S.-India relations that they look at all the time. But longer term, I do think that there are some concerns that slowly these things do start to bleed over. And so far, you haven't really seen either side take a strong interest in shoring up the commercial element as part of a combined approach vis-a-vis China. I think the United States a couple of years ago had thought that our work with the trying to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership moving was a way to bridge economies, around China together. India was not a part of that grouping. India chose to go with RCEP and later withdrew from that. So I think on econ commercial, we have yet to really hit the same kind of pace to work together the way that we've done on security matters. And I don't really see that changing, at least not in the next 6 months.
So, Ambassador Shankar, how can we hit that sweet spot where the strategic interests and the trade and commercial interests align? Because that would be the bedrock of this huge, deepening of ties, etc., that we're all talking about, isn't it? India is hoping to become an alternative to China in a lot of ways, and the United States needs to put the money where the mouth is.
Yes, I think there are two things which should really help take a broader view of the trade and investment relationship. Otherwise, there are always sectoral interests on both sides, which feel they are not getting a fair go at the other's market, or protectionism, which comes in the way of the free flow of trade in goods and services or investment. So I think taking a broader view would involve a recognition that India and the US are complementary economies. We are not competing economies in a sense. Even if you look at our IT sector, which is the most integrated with the US because it exports mainly to the US market, it is servicing the US market, and in that process, it's building US competitive advantage and profits for US companies. It's not really out there at the moment, as a competitor to the US. Similarly, many areas of innovation in India are really dedicated for US companies, which have their own laboratories and R&D facilities in India. And much of the innovation which occurs here has relevance not just for India, but for other developing countries, and some very high-tech innovation as well, such as chip design, which takes place in India. So there is a complementarity between the two economies. Both sides would have an interest in reducing dependence on China. For India, There are critical areas where we need to reduce dependence. And there is also the possibility that other countries looking at reducing their dependence on China or de-risking single source supplies would look at India as a potential investment destination. And it's for India to see how we can meet their expectations in terms of creating a business environment which is attractive enough for companies to see India as an alternative. And here I would say that reducing not just the ease of business, which we talk about, but somehow reducing the cost of doing business in India would be important. Thirdly, there is a level of trust between the two countries and between companies in the two countries. So, and finally, I think there's an opportunity because India needs investment in a huge number of sectors. It's going to be a big mega market of the future, even though we may be having difficulties right now post-COVID. In the future, it's going to bounce back, at least in the medium to long term. And the market is going to be huge. So if you take this broader view of the trade and economic relationship, then I think we would be able to put many of these sectoral issues in perspective and find a modus vivendi.
Just one question, Ambassador Shankar, on what I'd asked Rick as well. All of this, talk right now, does it sustain even with a potential political change in the US government in November? Do you think things will change with a possible Democrat government?
I think the India-US relationship is driven by a convergence of interests, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that will remain. I mean, if you look at some of the actions, for instance, designating India as a major defense partner, I think that happened under President Obama. Then it was carried on under President Trump, and the defense and strategic relationship has become stronger. So I would certainly hope that if there is a change in government, the India-US relationship will find bipartisan support. There may be nuances, on human rights or other issues to which a democratic government or administration may give more importance. But broadly, I would say the relationship with India has been sustained by support from both the United States and increasingly in India too. I think there's broad recognition that it is in the mutual interest of India and the United States to build the relationship.
Absolutely. Mr. Dasgupta, I wanted to come to you on the specific issues that we need to iron out vis-a-vis data localization and the digital tax. On the tech side, I also say this because, we have taken very strong action against 59 Chinese apps. But the fact is that officially that action isn't against the apps of any one country. Our take is it is against apps which breach privacy concerns, etc. Looking at the direction that we're going and the fact that we have not shown any signs of relenting on things like data localization and even hardening our stand on the digital tax, do you see that as a hiccup on the way?
It is one of the most important issues that will have to be ironed out between the US and India, because we are on opposite sides of the spectrum. Whereas the US asks for free flow of data across borders, we want data localization, in short. So that is one of the most contentious issues, because in the years to come, in the next few decades, data, as has been mentioned by our Prime Minister also in the past, it is going to be the new oil. And we are planning and aiming to have millions of jobs created through the digital economy, through using big data and data analytics. So if the data itself is not going to remain in the country and it is going to be taken out, then it would be difficult to build up an economy based on that resource. So this is one of the issues which will definitely take up a lot of time between the US and Indian negotiators. The second point that you raised about this equalization levy of 2% for e-commerce companies operating from outside without having a physical presence in India, that is something which has already come up for discussion between France and the US, because the US has retaliated against the French imposition or announcement of taxes by imposing duties on about approximately $1.2 billion worth of goods. Now, this is also one of the issues which was discussed in the G20 finance ministers meeting held recently, because there are two aspects to this. One is that if you don't have a physical presence, and the second aspect is that if you go and register yourself in a tax haven, then you end up paying nothing in the country where you are operating and getting a lot of revenues and data also from. So this is something which will lead to base erosion. And the OECD has also done a very good paper on this, which formed the base for the discussions in the G20 finance ministers meeting. So this is something which is not only between the US and India, but a lot of countries which aspire to use the digital economy in future as a means of providing employment, of gaining incomes, of raising the livelihoods of their people, they will be concerned about this. And there are differences of opinion between the US and the EU. And of course, the Chinese are on a separate platform altogether, because they have ensured that no data flows out of their country without their knowledge or their permission. So this issue will need to be sorted out sooner or later, rather sooner, in an international forum.
No, but that's the point. That's the point, Ajay Dua. That's the point. That this issue. I mean, I think I have been speaking to you and some of the people on this panel about data localization for nearly a year now. So we know that this issue has been a long-standing one, and positions have only hardened. So do you really see a way out?
See, let's look at it. If we are talking about an FTA with the US, probably that will be an issue. If it's a limited one, I think we can put it aside for a while and do where there is congruence of interest and go ahead with those. Similarly, I would say localization is, while it's a concern for us and for China, the US companies have raised that issue, but they're practical and realizing how big the Chinese market is, they did not let it become an issue to things on the ground. Similarly, India, there's an estimate that the current consumer market in India is about $1.25 trillion. And in the next 10 years, by 2030, it's going to be 4 times more. That is going to be over $5 trillion. Having said that, I think the US will continue to raise it, but I'm hoping that there will be greater pragmatism, as was shown by the e-commerce companies of the US, including Amazon, when, if you would recall, in 2016 and 2017 early, we changed the rules about inventory-based e-commerce in India. The US government protested, Amazon led the charge, and at the end of the day, we did not relent, but we found that Amazon and others adjusted their business model and openly said so when they were asked, saying, how are you growing? Here you are saying that it's something which is hurting your interest. There, your volumes are growing. They said, no, we've adjusted to the model. So I'm hoping that looking at the size of the Indian market and what we've seen in the last 1 month or so, investments from the US, including Amazon announcing increase of investment in India, Walmart saying that it's going to put in a $1.25 billion in India. That will continue while these issues, like important as they might be, but they will remain on board, but we will continue to grow our trade and investment relationship.
Let me just get Rick Rossow's perspective on data localization, and I want to add to this also, Rick. I'd like to hear from you on 5G. This came up during some of the sessions today as well at the event where the Prime Minister spoke. And 5G is going to be a crucial one. Everyone now suddenly wants to keep the Chinese out of it. Where is the potential of working together for India and the United States?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the data localization. A few things I wanted to add to what the other speakers had brought up. First, when we think about China, actually a lot of US data companies have chosen not to be in China. Others have not been able to go to China. So, China is not the model to necessarily follow if India wants to be a part of kind of this global system. In fact, it's been one of the areas that has actually helped to drive the current problems that the United States and China have. Well, I think back to a few years ago when, we still saw that China strategically was becoming a bigger rival. You saw that the U.S. corporate interest in China were one of the bulwarks against the United States, really kind of changing its position and adopting a more adversarial approach to China. And now that a lot of companies, including data companies, have kind of got fed up with trying to adapt to that system, that's one of the reasons I think, too, that the Trump administration has had a freer hand on becoming more aggressive versus China. Companies just don't see the kind of returns they were hoping for, and companies that are in the data space, are very active in that. I think when we talk about India and data controls, there's kind of three different levels that I look at it. One is, what is India going to do locally for data that's captured there? The second, which, you think about the first draft of the Personal Data Protection Bill, it's got kind of ambiguous language as well on how India would control data of foreigners, right? So a lot of US companies that have tens of thousands of employees in India don't touch a single piece of Indian employee data or Indian consumer data. It's all foreigners' data that's managed there. And there's some blanket provisions that may cover that data as well with local rules. And I presume that's probably not what India was trying to get at. And if so, then, hundreds of thousands of jobs could potentially be at risk if suddenly India becomes a more difficult place to manage foreigners' data, because, as you know, Philippines and other markets are becoming a lot more savvy and really sort of picking up a lot of IT service-related jobs. So when we talk about data localization, it's not just Indian citizens' data, but some of the provisions in the first draft would cover foreigners' data as well. A third issue that I know a lot of U.S. companies bring up is this idea about for internet companies having to anonymize data and then share that with the government.
I think it's telling that. Sorry to just interject there, Rick. I was just saying, I think it's telling that the whole issue has been allowed to hang fire for so long with no final say from India either. This is a draft that has been in draft mode for so long because it still has a lot of ironing out left in it.
Yeah. Well, and it is moving, right? I mean, referred to committee, the committee's been reviewing. The Ministry of IT had a second report that an expert group was doing. They just released the draft a couple of days ago. So, kind of there in the trenches, which I only see bits and pieces of with my sort of think tank life. There is steady movement, right? And it's shaping all the time and a really vibrant debate there. So I wouldn't say it's just kind of thrown out there in status quo. There's a lot of deliberations that are happening, it's been a very rich set of discussions, I think. I know a lot of companies that have been engaged in it find that a lot of members of parliament understand. So I suspect you'll see some modifications to what finally comes out. The last issue you brought up, I think, crucially important, 5G. Here, obviously, we think that this is an area where you have a lot of complementarity. I know the U.S. position on this, as well as India sometimes, has been sort of hard to pin down. Sometimes the United States is very antagonistic vis-a-vis Chinese 5G. And then the Trump administration begins allowing U.S. companies to sell technology again to Chinese 5G producers. India said no China 5G, and then testing would be allowed. I do think India has the benefit, with what you see with this virtual implosion of the telecom sector, it may be a few more years before India sees massive investments in a 5G rollout. And their, countries, other companies, the ability to pick up the pace and start investing and having a product out there, won't be such a China-heavy market that you'll be able to choose from. So from my own conversations with the Indian government, it seems that, the position is fairly firm. Private companies, if it's the difference between, low-cost Chinese product is the difference between being able to roll out a network and not, then you'll start to see other pressures. But I think we're a couple of years out from there. So feels like conversations are really kind of in the right place, but anything's far from firmly settled.
Absolutely. Well, I think some big promises there, but like we said in the beginning of the show, we will have to see if action and words actually match. The quotes, the statements are all fantastic, just what everyone wants to hear as far as the India-US relationship is concerned. We need to see if it gets hammered down to a trade deal and that extent of reciprocity on both sides. I want to thank all of you for joining us on the discussion this evening. We'll take a very short break on the show. When we come back, we're going to throw some light on what is happening with gold. The yellow metal has now crossed 50,000 rupees per 10 grams. We're going to break down that story for you after this break. Don't go away.